She handed the coffee over with a quiet smile, just a splash of cream, no sugar, right in front of the inspector. Her boss didn't yell, didn't argue, just said 4 words that shattered everything. "You're done here, Grace. 6 years of loyalty, gone in a breath." She didn't beg. She didn't cry. She walked out, fired for standing by a veteran and his service dog. But someone had been recording. And by the time the cafe's morning crowd had finished their breakfast, the parking lot thundered with the arrival of 4 military Humvees. A Marine colonel stepped out, a man with a debt to repay, and what happened next turned one quiet act of defiance into a national reckoning. The mug was still warm in her hands when she passed it over the counter. "Dark roast, splash of cream, no sugar," Grace said, smiling softly. Ray McMillan gave a small nod in return, the kind you give when words are hard to come by. He looked older than his 58 years, but there was something solid in his posture. Marine Corps posture, unmistakable even now. Shadow, the black and tan German Shepherd mix at his side, didn't stir. The red vest he wore read plainly, "Service dog, do not pet." Grace didn't need to read it. She'd memorized it long ago. "Corner seats open," she added, gesturing gently toward the window. Ray murmured a quiet thanks and moved that way, Shadow keeping pace like a shadow should. The moment passed as it always did, quiet, steady, respectful. Grace returned to the counter and refilled a pot without thinking. The cafe hummed with low voices, silverware tapping ceramic, chairs scraping across wood. It was a typical morning, until it wasn't. The front door swung open with a gust of cold air and a woman in a dark blazer stepped inside. Her heels clicked like punctuation marks on tile. Behind her, a tall man in a pressed state uniform followed, his clipboard already out, eyes scanning. Grace's stomach dropped. "Morning," she said, keeping her voice neutral. "Can I help you?" The man didn't look up. Logan Prescott, State Health Inspection, unannounced. The woman beside him stepped forward. "Deborah Lyle, Corporate Oversight, just here to observe." Grace nodded slowly, pulse starting to pick up. Prescott moved like a hawk, checking surfaces, peering into fridges, snapping photos. Then he froze. "That animal," he said sharply, pointing toward the shadow. "That's a health code violation. No animals permitted where food is served." Conversations halted. Chairs stopped mid-scrape. Grace stepped out from behind the counter. "He's a registered service dog," she said, voice even. "Georgia law permits him to be here." "I don't care what vest he's wearing," Prescott snapped. "You want this cafe shut down?" Ray hadn't moved. Shadow's ears twitched, but he stayed at his master's side. "I won't ask a veteran to leave," Grace said, quieter now, but firmer. "And I won't ask his service dog to leave either." The silence that followed felt like a held breath. Deborah's voice cut through it like frost. "Grace Donnelly, you've just violated corporate health policy in front of a state inspector. You're terminated, effective immediately." Someone gasped. A fork hit the floor. Grace stood still. Then slowly she reached behind her, untied her apron, folded it once, and laid it gently on the counter. She looked at Ray, then at Lena, the barista near the espresso machine. "Make sure he gets his refill," she whispered, and then she walked out. Not because she broke a rule, but because she wouldn't break her soul. The door closed behind her with the softest click, but inside the cafe, it echoed like a gunshot. Grace was gone. The counter stood unmanned. Her folded apron rested on top like a flag draped over something lost. Nobody moved at first. It was as if the whole place had been unplugged, mugs half lifted, conversations cut mid-sentence, the hum of belonging suddenly replaced by a sharp, invisible silence. Lena stood frozen by the espresso machine, her hands still wrapped around a damp cloth, eyes wide and unblinking. She had never seen Grace raise her voice, let alone get fired. Not like that. Not for doing what everyone here knew in their bones was the right thing. Ray hadn't left his corner. He sat perfectly still, back straight, hand wrapped around the mug Grace had handed him just minutes ago. He hadn't taken a sip. Shadow, the service dog, stayed at his feet, head resting on his paws, eyes trained forward. Waiting. Steady. Just like he'd been taught. Prescott, the inspector, adjusted his clipboard and muttered something under his breath. Deborah Lyle's mouth was tight, jaw clenched, as if she could feel the weight of the eyes now on her, not just from customers, but from the quiet, unseen thing that had just been cracked open in the room. Near the back, by the window, a teenage boy sat stunned, his phone in his lap. He hadn't meant to record anything, not at first, but when Prescott's voice started rising and Grace stepped between him and the dog, his thumb instinctively tapped record. Now the video blinked on his screen, time-stamped and trembling slightly from his hands. Without thinking, he hit send. To his friend, then his sister, then TikTok. By the time Lena finally poured Ray his refill, still without a word, the clip had already been shared more than 100 times. A minute later, a retired Army mechanic in Texas watched it and sent it to his brother in the National Guard. Then a Navy nurse in Virginia. Then someone on a base in Georgia. No hashtags, no filters, just 37 seconds of quiet defiance. Grace hadn't spoken a word after the firing, but the silence she left behind was louder than anything she could have said. Colonel Richard Gaines had already been at his desk for 2 hours when the knock came. 3 short raps, crisp and efficient. His aide, Corporal Bell, stepped in without waiting. "Sir, you need to see this." Gaines looked up from a stack of logistics reports, raising one eyebrow. Bell didn't speak again, just held out a tablet. On screen, a cafe. Modest, warm. A woman, mid-30s, flannel shirt, apron, stands between a clipboard-wielding inspector and a man sitting quietly with a service dog. The inspector's voice is clipped, sharp. The woman doesn't raise hers. She just stands her ground. A few words, a folded apron, a walkout, then silence. Gaines didn't blink as he watched. The entire clip lasted 37 seconds. He played it again. This time, he noticed the dog, steady, obedient, trained to be invisible. He noticed the man's hands, rough, calloused, trembling just slightly around the mug, and he noticed the woman, Grace, the name stitched faintly on her apron, stepping in like it wasn't even a decision, just instinct, just what decent people do. Bell cleared his throat. It's been viewed over 500,000 times. Military forums, vet networks, social channels. People are calling it the Mason mug stand. Gaines didn't answer right away. He reached across his desk and turned down the volume on the radio, playing cadence calls from the drill field. Outside the window, the base moved with mechanical rhythm, uniforms in formation, boots hitting gravel in time. But inside the colonel's office, the world had gone still. He stood slowly, smoothing the front of his uniform with practiced precision. "Where is this cafe?" he asked. "Mason, 15 minutes southeast, corner of Main and Briar," Bell replied, already anticipating the next order. "Get the convoy ready. I want 4 Humvees, full dress blues. Tell the men this is a formal appearance." Bell hesitated. "Sir, what's the mission?" Gaines looked him in the eye, voice low but clear. "The mission," he said, is to show the town of Mason that some uniforms don't fade after war, and that when someone defends one of our own, we answer." Then he picked up the phone. "We're going into town." The cafe hadn't returned to normal. It couldn't. Grace was gone, and with her something invisible but vital had left the air, like the hum in a room after the power cuts. The counter stood empty. The register screen blinked quietly. Lena moved on autopilot, her hands trembling as she topped off Ray's coffee without asking. She didn't look him in the eye. She couldn't. Not yet. Ray hadn't said a word. He still sat at his window seat, shadow curled beneath him, unmoving. He hadn't touched his cup, only held it like he was anchoring himself to something familiar, something steady. The way Grace had spoken to him, how she stood without flinching. It echoed now, louder than the awkward murmurs filling the cafe. Customers whispered, glancing toward the door like someone might come back through and say it had all been a misunderstanding. But no one did. The corporate woman had retreated to a quiet booth in the corner, nervously tapping at her phone. The inspector was now reviewing his clipboard again, pretending to still care about refrigerator temps and hand-washing signs. And then it happened. A low sound, distant but growing. A vibration before a noise like a thunderstorm coming up the road. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Glasses rattled. One woman looked up from her tablet. Someone else stood and pressed a hand to the window. The rumble deepened, tires, big ones, coming slow, deliberate. From the east end of Main Street, through the light mist and under the arch of maple trees, 4 military Humvees emerged like giants. Their matte green bodies crawled down the road in a perfect line, lights cutting through the haze. It didn't feel like an escort, it felt like a reckoning. They rolled into the cafe's parking lot one after the other, engines idling like lions waiting for the order to move. Doors opened in unison. Boots hit pavement. A dozen Marines stepped out, followed by another dozen. At their head stood a man in full dress blues, polished, imposing, controlled. He moved with a purpose that made people sit up straighter without realizing it. Then the cafe door opened, and the room stopped breathing. The bell above the cafe door jingled, a soft sound, almost too delicate to follow the heavy echo of boots and rumbling engines. But when Colonel Richard Gaines stepped inside, the noise didn't matter. The air shifted the second his boot hit the tile. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and still as precise in posture as he had been 30 years ago on the parade grounds at Quantico. His dress blues were immaculate, buttons like coins, medals like quiet thunder across his chest. His white gloves were folded neatly in one hand, untouched. His eyes swept the room once, measuring, noting, but not judging. Behind him, through the glass, 24 Marines stood at full attention, not a twitch among them. Their presence outside the cafe looked more like a memorial detail than a military formation, and in a way it was. Inside, no one moved. Lena stood behind the counter, frozen, a damp towel still clenched in her hand. Ray was on his feet now, straight-backed, his eyes locked on the man he recognized immediately. Shadow sat at his heel, unmoving but alert, ears pricked. Colonel Gaines stepped further inside, the clack of his heel deliberate and calm. He stopped in the center of the cafe. "Is Grace Donnelly here?" he asked. The voice was even. Not loud, but it filled the room like a rising tide, steady and impossible to ignore. Lena swallowed hard. She was fired, sir, this morning, for defending Mr. McMillan and his dog." Gaines was quiet for a moment. He turned to Ray, who gave him a subtle nod, gruff but deep. The colonel returned it with something stronger. A salute. Then he turned to the rest of the room, to the customers, to the clipboard still clutched in the inspector's sweating hand. She served our people, Gaines said, with more dignity than most systems ever did. There was no need to raise his voice. The weight of his words landed anyway, sharp and certain. She offered what no policy could, a place to breathe, a place to belong, and she did it without question, without hesitation. Nobody interrupted. Nobody dared. Grace Donnelly didn't fail this cafe, he said. This cafe failed her. Then he turned back to the door, and with one small motion of his hand, the rest of the Marines began to move. The Marines moved with quiet precision, like they were on a detail that mattered more than any parade or promotion. 2 of them stepped behind the counter without hesitation, their boots respectful on the tile, their hands careful. The corporate logo, a sleek plastic sign with brushed metal edges and sterile font, was unscrewed from the wall. It came down slowly, deliberately, like a curtain closing on the end of something hollow. The inspector, Prescott, stood near the pastry case, his clipboard limp at his side, lips parted as if to speak, but with nothing to say. He looked small now, like the weight of the uniforms in the room had pushed the air out of him. Outside, customers gathered at the windows, peering through the glass like it might help them understand what was unfolding in front of them. The Marines didn't speak. They didn't need to. From one of the Humvees, a 3rd Marine emerged carrying a wooden board wrapped in a canvas sheet. He brought it in like it was something sacred. Together, they unwrapped it and revealed a hand-painted sign, simple, worn at the edges, but proud. Grace's house, where honor is served daily. It wasn't polished, it wasn't corporate, but it was real. When they mounted it above the counter, someone near the back of the cafe exhaled, as if they'd been holding their breath through the entire scene. Deborah Lyle, still seated near the corner booth, stood up abruptly. This is a private business, she said, her voice climbing in pitch. You can't just come in here and... Colonel Gaines turned to her, his expression unmoved. You've made your decision, he said, his tone cutting through the room like steel drawn from a sheath. Now we've made ours. She didn't reply, just stood frozen, unsure of whether to sit back down or run. The colonel nodded once to the Marines. No more commands were needed. A line had been drawn, not with protest signs or headlines, but with wood, paint, and principle. And above the register, Grace's name now lived in the place where policies used to. The cafe hadn't gone back to normal, because normal had shifted. Lena was still behind the counter, not serving so much as anchoring the room. The new sign above her head drew stares and quiet smiles from people who weren't sure whether to clap, pray, or sit down and order coffee like nothing had happened. Her hands were still trembling slightly when the cafe's landline rang. She answered it like she was answering a call from another planet. Mason Mugg, sorry, Grace's house, she said, voice unsure. This is Sergeant Wilder from Fort Granger. Is Miss Donnelly present? Lena blinked. She's not here. She was fired earlier today. There was a pause on the other end. Then, firmly, tell Miss Donnelly she's expected at base headquarters this afternoon. Colonel Gaines would like a word. Click. No room for debate. No explanation. Just orders. Lena looked around the cafe. Someone had overheard. Probably the man by the window with the folded newspaper that hadn't turned a page in 30 minutes. Within minutes, the word had spread, quietly, like smoke through floorboards. By noon, the Mason Herald was on the phone, asking for a quote. A reporter from Channel 7 called the cafe twice. One woman tried to take a selfie beneath the new sign before Lena shooed her out with a look that said, "Not today." But Grace didn't know any of this. She sat in her truck, parked at the edge of her gravel driveway, one hand gripping the steering wheel like it might float away. She hadn't changed out of her work shirt. Her apron was on the passenger seat, still folded, coffee-stained. Her front porch light was on, even though it was midday. She hadn't turned it off this morning. She hadn't expected today to turn into a storm. Her phone buzzed. Once, then again. She didn't recognize the number, but the message was clear. You've been requested at Fort Granger, 1500 hours, main headquarters, Colonel Gaines. Grace stared at the screen. Then she looked up at the road. Something was happening. And whether she felt ready or not, it was already waiting for her. Fort Granger stretched out before her like a memory Grace wasn't sure she was ready to relive. The gates were familiar, white, solid, ceremonial, but this time she wasn't coming with muffins or folding letters from care packages. This time she was expected. Colonel Gaines met her just past the checkpoint. He wasn't in dress blues now, just crisp khakis and that steady gaze that didn't miss much. He didn't bother with pleasantries. "Walk with me," he said simply. They moved across the grounds in silence at first, boots crunching gravel. Grace watched young soldiers in formation, a few jogging past in cadence, others adjusting gear, arms sunburnt and shoulders squared. It was a different world, but one she knew, or used to. They stopped in front of a low pale brick building on the edge of the administrative circle. No sign on the door, just flaking paint and the quiet hum of fluorescent lights bleeding through curtained windows. "This is the Veteran Transition and Wellness Center," Gaines said. At least, that's what it was meant to be. He pushed the door open. Inside, dust danced in the late afternoon light. Folding chairs were stacked against the wall. Whiteboards sat blank, leaning unused in a corner. A coffee machine stood unplugged near an outlet. Boxes marked supplies and donations sat unopened. Grace stepped inside slowly. The air smelled of storage and stale hope. "We've been trying to launch this for 2 years," Gaines continued. "But what we need, what these men and women need, can't come from policy alone." She turned toward him. "I'm not a counselor. I'm not a specialist." "You're something more rare," he said, voice quieter now. "You made people feel human again. You created safety without fanfare. You did it with coffee, names remembered, a seat by the window. No degrees, no grants, just presence." Grace didn't speak. Her fingers brushed a dusty mug left on a side table. Probably someone's long forgotten. She thought of Ray, of Shadow, of Lena standing behind that empty counter, of the photo above the register. "What are you asking?" she said finally. "I want you to run this place," Gaines replied. "Not as a figurehead, as its heart." She let the silence sit for a moment, then nodded once. "Let's get to work." The first thing Grace did was open the windows. The air inside the wellness center was thick with stillness, the kind that settles when a place has been waiting too long to matter. She rolled up her sleeves and started clearing space, not just physically but emotionally. It wasn't going to be a clinic. It wasn't going to be another folder-driven bureaucracy. It was going to be something warmer, something real. She rearranged the furniture, not in rows but in circles. She brought in rugs. She hung a bulletin board by the front door, tacked up with a hand-scrawled sign. "Need a ride? Leave a note. Want to talk? Leave a name." The coffee machine from the cafe was installed in the corner by a retired electrician who refused to take payment. Grace filled the shelves with mismatched mugs, donations from town, old favorites from veterans' homes, even a chipped one from her own kitchen. And then they came. Ray arrived first. He didn't say much, just walked the perimeter of the main room like he was checking its perimeter for danger. Shadow found a corner and curled up like he already knew this place was safe. Ray sat down slowly and didn't leave for 2 hours. Lena joined on Fridays. She brought coffee, yes, but also stories and a softness that made the walls feel less institutional. When Grace asked her why she kept coming back, she just shrugged. "Because if you're going to build something good," she said, "someone's got to help hold the nails." More veterans came, some drawn by word of mouth, others by the still circulating video. One left a sketch of Grace taped to the fridge, done in pencil, just her behind the cafe counter with a steaming mug. Another left a note folded in half. "You made me want to try again." They didn't ask for therapy. They didn't ask for speeches. They just wanted a place where their silence wasn't mistaken for weakness. And Grace gave it to them. Not through training manuals or degrees, but through steady presence. Day by day, the center changed shape. Not into a cafe, but into something deeper. A sanctuary where dignity wasn't spoken. It was simply understood. The letter came in a plain white envelope with a gold seal in the corner. No fanfare, no advance notice. Just a quiet thud in her mailbox one Monday morning, slipped between a utility bill and a coupon flyer. Grace opened it at the kitchen counter, still wearing her flannel and old jeans, coffee half drunk beside her. The words blurred the first time she read them, and the second. "You are hereby nominated for the National Civilian Commendation for Distinguished Service to Veterans." She let the letter fall gently to the counter and stared out the window for a long time. The wind was pushing the trees gently, and somewhere in the distance she could hear the bass cadence calls echoing against the hills. She didn't feel proud. Not exactly. She felt quiet, humbled in the way that made her breath catch in her chest. The center had changed since that first day. The couches had settled, worn in by elbows and heavy stories. The coffee pot never stayed full for long. A therapy dog in training named Buddy had started showing up with a young Marine named Cassie, who didn't talk much but always cleaned the mugs before she left. Every wall held a photo now. Ray smiling beside Shadow, Lena laughing with a group of wives and husbands, a sketch of Grace drawn in charcoal by a veteran who hadn't picked up a pencil in 5 years. But it was the bulletin board by the door that Grace always looked at last before locking up each night. It was crowded now. Rides offered, names written in block letters, little notes pinned on napkins or scrap paper. One note had been up for 3 weeks. Grace had read it a dozen times, never moved it, never pinned anything near it. It simply said, "I didn't think I mattered. Then I met you." No name, no signature. And to Grace, that was the only recognition that ever really mattered. Because she hadn't set out to earn a medal. She'd just refused to ignore someone who needed a seat, a mug, and a little bit of space to heal. And sometimes that's enough to change everything.